You would think that when an argument is sufficiently debunked, people would stop using it. One would hope that people would see that said argument no longer holds water and would remove it from intellectual discourse. Sadly, you would be wrong! Apologetic arguments have been around for as long as ideas about gods have, and the same tired few have stuck around to plague humanity despite being riddled with bullet holes and having been torn to shreds time and time again. One of the oldest, and in my view weakest, arguments for a personal god is the Kalam Cosmological Argument, which is the subject of our video today. It started around 1000 AD by Al-Ghazali to prove the existence of Allah, the god of Islam, who is actually the same Abrahamic god as Christianity and Judaism, but don't tell him that. Al-Ghazali believed, in contrast to philosophers like Plato, who thought the universe to be eternal, that the universe had a finite beginning, and that Allah was the cause of that beginning, because of course he was, and also the cause of everything that begins. This is spelled out in the argument, or at least in the modern interpretation of it. For my discussion on this argument, I will define the universe as the composite sum of all matter, space, time, and energy, because the argument itself doesn't spell that out. At its core, the argument is this. Premise 1. Whatever began to exist has a cause. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. Conclusion. The universe has a cause. Modern usages of this argument add on the following. Premise 3. If something began to exist, that cause is God/Allah. Conclusion. God exists. Let's look at premise 1 a bit closer. This is a pretty big assumption that everything began to exist has a cause. This model of the universe is presupposed using the a-theory of time, or presentism, meaning that time is not actually infinite and indeed has a beginning. The reasoning goes something like this. If the past were infinitely long, an infinite amount of time would have had to have passed from then till now. Since infinite time can never actually pass, the universe cannot be infinitely old and therefore must have had a beginning. This stands in opposition to the B-theory of time, called eternalism, which proposes the universe as an eternal four-dimensional space-time block, thus never beginning nor ending. However, eternalism seems to be the default viewpoint in philosophical/scientific discussion, as philosopher Yuri Balashov explains, quote, "Despite the fact that presentism has the firm backing of common sense, and eternalism revolts against it, eternalism is widely regarded as almost the default view in contemporary debates, and presentism as a highly problematic view," close quote. In other words, many apologists take the idea of presentism and present it as the uncontested norm, ignoring the debate that to this day surrounds the topic. Link to Balashov's presentation in the description below. There are several other problems with this argument, though, as I intend to show. One of the biggest ones being that this argument is almost always used to prove the existence of a specific, personal god. In other words, presupposing that premise 3 is true without any sort of proof that the universe could only have been created by the god in question and not, say, Odin, Izanagi, an amorphous blob, or some combination thereof. This, in formal terms, is called begging the question. Al-Ghazali's original argument omits premise 3 altogether, it's important to note. This is a modern addition, though Al-Ghazali still believed it to support the unstated conclusion he had that his God exists. Either we have to presuppose that God caused everything, but if we were going to do that, why even bother coming up with an argument for it? Or we have to allow the possibility that God wasn't the cause, or at least not the sole cause, which Christian/Islamic ideology claims him to be. At the same time, the cause could have been my kitchen sink, for all Al-Ghazali argues, and going further reaches beyond what naturally follows from the premises. Another issue I have with this argument is that it allows for the possibility of spontaneous generation ex nihilo, which, as far as I can tell, isn't a thing, or at least one that hasn't been documented in any peer-reviewed journals of any kind. Everything that we have observed in nature is made from something. This is true. For example, glucose is made through enzymatic reactions using carbon-based substrates inside plants using the energy from sunlight. If we remove the starting materials, enzymes, or the sunlight, photosynthesis stops. If we introduce them, it starts up again. This is observably true. Sugar does not care about your feelings. Glucose has not been observed, however, to randomly pop into existence without any of those things. However, even though glucose has a clear quote-unquote cause, it's unclear whether the individual atoms that make it up do. Spontaneous generation is, as far as we presently understand, logically incoherent. If it were possible for something to spontaneously come into existence uncaused out of nothing, then there would have to be a potential or probability that something could do that. Probabilities depend on initial conditions, so that would mean nothing had properties. To have properties is to exist, so it would mean that nothing is actually something, which is a contradiction. Since the universe includes the sum of all matter, in order for the universe to have a cause, matter would have to have come from non-matter, which is the entire point of spontaneous generation. If it's possible at the beginning of the universe, I see no reason that it should stop afterward. Thus, we should have sugar and other things randomly popping into existence, but we don't. The biggest issue with this argument in my mind, though, is that it opens the door for an infinite regress. In other words, something, the argument can't tell us what, caused the universe to be, but what caused that? This creates a cycle of things which goes on forever, because the cause of the universe had to have had a cause, which cause also needs a cause, and so on. Some arguers have proposed the idea of an uncaused cause, something that never began to exist and therefore doesn't need a cause, but this feels like a cop-out to avoid addressing the issue, largely because this cannot be measured or observed in any way and relies on something that transcends the universe by definition. In order to cause space, time, matter, and energy, which as I described earlier, all those things together constitute the universe, to come into being, this requires God to be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and without energy. Given that the physics definition of energy is the ability to do work or cause change, we again have a problem because the cause cannot have energy, thus rendering it impotent and unable to be the cause. Apologists like William Lane Craig have proposed solutions to the infinity problem which fail to address the problem while looking like they do at first glance. Craig says that the idea of infinity is just an idea as stated here. Quote, the idea of an actual infinity is just conceptual. It only works within our minds, however, it's not descriptive of what can happen in the real world, unquote. This is demonstrably untrue, at least as far as our current understanding of math goes, courtesy of George Cantor. Link to the paper in the description on the consistency of transfinite math. Even then, his defense fails because if we eliminate infinity, we eliminate a God who claims its existence and power are infinite, namely the Christian God, and Allah too. Craig argues for a supernatural being, his personal interpretation of the Christian God, namely, who he claims caused everything. However, either this entity would need to have a finite beginning and thus a cause, making it subject to the infinite regress, or it is infinite, which Craig just said is impossible. The Christian God would then need to be a finite being to actually exist, and since the Christian God claims to be infinite, but wouldn't be in this case, it would therefore be a liar, and in my eyes, about as worthy of worship as the average rock. Actually, no, it's an insult to rocks. Craig specifically references the Big Bang and the evidence around it as proof of his argument, so I'll give a brief crash course on it here, at least what's relevant to the argument. The Big Bang theory states that at some point in time, all matter in the universe was condensed into a singular ball, which then exploded at some point, hence the name. The matter-energy cocktail then in turn formed over billions of years, all that we know in the universe. The working models of the Big Bang are based on a series of assumptions that haven't matched up with what we observe in the universe. Long story short, there are some working models, but none of them is complete or consistent since we don't know the exact condition at the supposed bang. Again, I'll leave a link to the paper I'm using for this in the description. So the grand question here is, can we equate the bang with the first cause? Well, no! According to all the models I'm familiar with, the Big Bang is not the start of time, but simply an arbitrary point from which we started measuring it. Consider it the 0 AD of astronomic time. There was time before it, but we don't have any data about it because we don't know what happened at the bang. I will note, however, that Craig does support Big Bang cosmology and a perpetually expanding universe, but still holds to the idea that infinity isn't actually a thing. Standard cosmology tells us that an open universe, like the one of the Big Bang models, is by definition infinite, so Craig fails again as long as he holds to the idea that infinity is an illusion. Craig's arguments have gotten him no shortage of flack, including from fellow Christians, oddly enough. Quoting Dr. John Beale of the Department of Math at Trinity Western University, Quote, a further problem in arguing from the Big Bang to the biblical God is that the biblical view of reality as I read it is quite different from that of Big Bang cosmology. These differences involve not only matters of origins and eschatology, but also the present structure of the universe. For example, Big Bang cosmology has no place for a transcendent God, for supernatural causes, or for an immortal soul. Thus, in constructing a Christian view of reality, Big Bang cosmology must ultimately be replaced by cosmological concepts that are more in accord with biblical givens. It follows that Craig's argumentation has limited value as a means to bolster the faith of Christians. The acceptance of Craig's empirical evidence, to the extent that it involves a commitment to Big Bang cosmology, can only lead to a demise in biblical authority. Close quote. And since biblical authority is really the only thing propping Christianity's corpse up, there's no way that any self-respecting Christian would sacrifice it. Thus, the appeal to the Big Bang falls apart. Recap. The Kalam only successfully-ish argues for the existence of a prime mover, or an uncaused cause, but cannot adequately describe this entity. Either we're left with a vague, amorphous idea of the first cause, which isn't nearly useful enough for money-grubbing religious hustlers and apologetics who need clicks to stay relevant, or we have a concrete being with a clear beginning, which leads to an infinite regress of causes. Regardless, this argument does not support the existence of a specific, personal God and should not be used for such.